Hi, how are you? I hope you're doing well. My name is David Parsons. This is the Nostalgia Trap podcast. Thank you very much for tuning into the show however you found it. iTunes, Stitcher, nostalgiatrap.com, Twitter, Facebook. There's a million ways to get to the show. But thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I have in store for you today. I had a conversation with someone I actually met on Twitter through his Twitter feed that's about history and politics and being an adjunct professor of history in Los Angeles, running around to a million different campuses. I found that story very compelling and very similar to my life in New York, or my I should say my previous life. For 12 years, I was an adjunct in New York, running around like that, and I know very well the kind of perils and rewards of that lifestyle. So we had a great conversation about that, but we also talked about the branch of history that he does. David is an environmental historian, and he talks a little bit about what is meant by that. I think a lot of people don't know what that discipline is. So we talked about what an environmental historian actually does, and what their primary concerns are, and how that links up to Marxism and politics. Because I wanted to talk to David too as a kind of fellow historian on the left, what that was like in Los Angeles to go into graduate school at UC Irvine. Very, very different experiences, as it turns out, from the CUNY Graduate Center, which was crawling with Marxists and anarchists and radicals of all kind, and definitely made an impact on me in grad school. So we had a really great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. It was a fun time talking to David. You can find more of these conversations at nostalgiatrap.com. And if you want to support the show, I would really appreciate it. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I'm going to send out a new round of buttons and stickers very soon. So if you get your subscription in and send me your address, or keep your address updated on Patreon, you will be included in the next surprise package. So thanks a lot for supporting the show. For those that are doing it already, I really appreciate it. This is me talking to Professor David Fouser. I've talked about on the show before this concept. I don't know if you guys use this term out here in Los Angeles, the adjunct hustle. But you posted a tweet. I think it was a series of tweets last week where you're basically like describing your commute and your multiple classes that you teach all over LA, right?
Yeah, that's true.
How long have you been doing that?
A few years. I finished my Ph.D. in 2016. I was effectively an adjunct for a few years before that,
right,
while I was sort of, at the department at Irvine, but I didn't really teach there very much. Or I would teach there, but I would teach other places too. I have taught at least 2 institutions, and sometimes 3 at a time, for probably the last 5 years.
And so, I mean, I've been introduced because I'm starting to try to get into teaching here in California, since I've been teaching in New York for so long. I got to start over. But I've been hearing this term that people don't use in New York, but freeway flyer. I don't know if you heard this term.
Yes.
You know this?
Oh no, I lived the term.
The freeway flyer. So can you describe what is a typical, what is the maximum amount of classes you teach at different campuses? If you taught at 2 or I think the commute you were describing last week was 3 different campuses in one day.
Yeah. So generally, as an adjunct, you're going to be part-time everywhere, so it's going to be 1 or 2 classes at each place, right? So if you want a full load of 4 to 6 classes, that means 2 to 3 institutions with 1 or 2 classes each, right? And I live here in Northeast LA. We're quite close to Highland Park, and we're about 10 minutes north of downtown, so we're right by Dodger Stadium. And from here, on my busiest days, I will drive to Santa Monica on the west side first thing in the morning. I have to leave my house at 5:45 because if I leave at 5:45, I'll be in my office by 6:30. If I leave at 6, I'll be in my office at 7. If I leave at 6:15, I'll be there at 7:30 or 8.
Traffic.
Right. Yeah. So the traffic piles up so fast that you got to go early, right?
Yeah. Right.
I will teach morning classes in Santa Monica. Then I will drive to City of Orange, where I teach at Chapman University.
Oh, you go way out there.
Yeah. Oh,
wow.
and that's not even the farthest that
Okay.
I go. And so I'll teach sort of daytime and afternoon classes there, and then on my busiest days, I'll drive at night down to Laguna College of Art and Design and teach a night class there, and then drive home. So my longest days, I will leave at 5:45 a.m. and I'll get home at 11 p.m.
Jesus. Oh man. See, that's one of the more intense. I mean, I used to do that. I mean, just last semester I was doing that, going typically, in the early morning at one campus, then running to the subway and going to another campus, and then going uptown and going to my research job, and then usually going back to one of the campuses and meeting with students. But 5 in the morning till 11:45 at night, that's a long day.
Yeah.
Did you anticipate that academia would be like this? Did you have in your mind when you were younger that you would be kind of cobbling together a career like that, at least during graduate school and maybe in the years afterwards? Because I had no idea what the shape of academic life was really like besides my kind of pop cultural ideas about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I didn't have any idea what it would be like either, and I don't think I was smart enough to ask. I was just kind of like, hey, I'm pretty good at this. I might as well keep doing it.
Right.
And I started graduate school in 2007, so right before the most recent collapse of the global capitalist system.
Right.
And things looked a little rosier in, say, the mid-2000s. And then, I got into graduate school, and then things kind of fell apart.
Right.
And I sort of rode out Irvine through massive budget cuts.
Yep.
I don't know what I thought I was getting into. I know that I've been interested in history for as long as I can remember. And it's really the only thing that I ever wanted to do.
I want to go back to how that happened to you. You say you've been interested in history since as far back as you can remember, and I think that's probably true of me too. And I think there's not really one starting point I think about. But were your parents academics? Was
No.
history a part of your life growing up?
It's sort of. Both my parents are engineers. The moment that was really big for me was when I was about 7 or 8. I learned that my grandfather was a gunner on a bomber in World War II.
Wow.
And if you're like a 7-year-old boy, that's the coolest thing you can possibly imagine. And so I went to the library and I read every single book they had on World War II. And my parents said that they knew right then that that's what I was going to do with my life. And that sort of got me started, and that I was just a voracious reader all really through my life, right into high school. And then in high school I had probably about a 5-year period where my main interest was being as destructive to myself and others as possible. And so I didn't read very much then. Yeah.
In high school?
Right.
So high school you were not valedictorian?
No, I was not. I was not an awesome student. I was a terrible student. And I would go so far as to say I was a terrible human being for most of it.
Well, what was the... It's kind of difficult to reconcile in terms of thinking of you as this scholar that's very interested in World War II, and a sense of I feel like that this came up in I think with the interview I did with Matt Christman from Chapo. He was talking about how so many young boys especially get into history through either the Civil War or World War II because they're this instances of righteous violence, and you
Absolutely.
feel was that something that was part of your landscape?
Oh, absolutely. Because World War II, probably more than the Civil War, at least out west. I'm sure that back east, the Civil War is much more present because there's battlefields and things like that, right?
That's true.
But the Civil War, hardly registered on my consciousness very much growing up. But World War II was the thing. I was aware that it was the central geopolitical event of this era, right? That it defined kind of everything. It reset our compass of good and evil. It was just sort of the biggest, most important event that I could possibly
I always like to
imagine.
say to my students that it delivered us into a comic book reality with nuclear bombs and the possibility of worldwide destruction. But I'm thinking about also that's interesting you mentioned the East Coast West Coast thing, because World War II is very much like a LA war in some respects, right? Were you aware of that growing up? The
Hardly at
LA
all.
LA connection? Yeah.
No. Basically not at all.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that probably comes up later, is that for me it was learning about my grandparents meeting because they were my grandfather was stationed in the Navy in LA, and my grandmother was working in the aircraft and munitions factories down there, and they met at some ball that was meant to put the factory girls together with the soldiers. It cannot be more cliche LA World War II
Right.
comic book stuff. But so yeah, since you had a rough high school, it sounds like, where you are not the top scholar. So how do you return? How do you like get it back? Where do you like come back to books and learning and doing well in school? I feel like lots of smart people don't do well in school.
Yeah.
There's a difference between that, being smart and doing well in school, obviously.
I mean, I think that in high school, I hung out with people that were mostly losers. And I apologize if any of them are listening. We had a great time, but like most of them were like losers.
Well, they were losers at the time. Who knows?
That's
They could
true.
be winners now.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe a few.
You're
Maybe
like-
a few.
Yeah.
Some of them I think have done quite well, but like, a lot of them, I knew quite a few people that ended up in prison and like were just doing all kinds of bad stuff. And so I was rolling with a rough crowd. And by the time I graduated, I was kind of drifting away from that. I wasn't as dedicated to drugs as a lot of them ended up being.
Yeah.
And so I kind of got bored of that as they were doubling down on that. And I was very lucky to meet my wife, who sort of came along, and she really straightened me out. She really like made new things important. And we had our daughter when we were quite young, so we got married at 20 and we had our daughter at 21.
Wow. How old are you now?
I'm 38. Well, I will be 38 in 2 soon.
Yeah, we're almost exactly the same age.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the reasons I noticed you on social media, is because we had a lot of kind of like biographical similarities. Yeah.
Similar. I mean, definitely cultural references.
For sure. So having a daughter, getting married very early, seems like it's something that made things a little more serious.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really showed me, which is the thing that I think like young people, and especially like, let's be frank, like young white males with middle class backgrounds, like really need to learn that they are not the center of the universe.
Right.
And that, other people matter, and that you have to like play a role in society. And by the time my wife and I met, I had gotten it together enough that I was going to school, and I was going to Cal State Northridge. And this was 1999, and at that point it was still relatively easy to get into a Cal State. Yeah. So my high school grades were terrible. My SAT scores were whatever, they're sort of mediocre. But that was enough to get me into Cal State Northridge. And my wife came along, and that really got me serious. And I remember the semester that our daughter was born, I got mainly C's as a period of adjustment. And then the semester after that, I didn't get another B for the rest of ever.
So something happened. I mean, what was it that you were studying at CSUN? Do you remember?
History.
History, and were there things that caught your mind, your imagination at CSUN? I mean, was that when
I think I had really good teachers.
Yeah. Who was there? I guess because I know that you like went towards British history. So like, was that happening at CSUN? Were you already attracted to?
Oh yeah, totally. So like growing up, I'd read all that stuff about my grandfather, and one of the things that I got from that was that histories of America in World War II were quite boring because America just like kicked ass.
Yes.
And it was pretty one-dimensional.
It's Captain America.
Yeah. And we were just amazing. And, those books were like pretty boring. But the books about Britain in World War II were fascinating because they almost lost.
Yeah.
The Battle of Britain in particular was this like pivotal moment where like a lot of things in our world would be very different if things had not gone the way they did. And so that really got me into, I sort of had a special spot for British history. I had a special interest in that, but I didn't come to CSUN thinking like, I'm going to study British history. But I started to take history classes. I'd really gotten my act together. I was much more serious about school and, really trying to learn as much as I could and just do the best I could. And then it happened that the British historian at Northridge, a man named Jeff Auerbach, was just, it still is, an incredible instructor. He's an incredible teacher. He is so smart and so clear in how he would sort of explain things and open up so much with his lectures and his assignments and the things he'd make us read and all that stuff. And I sort of quickly realized that, and I was like, okay, this is the guy that I need to
What's
follow.
his specialty?
He's the British historian there. He wrote his dissertation on the Great Exhibition of 1851.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering, like 19th, 20th century,
Yeah, so he
because
wrote
British
it on,
history is so much longer, obviously.
Right.
Like you can, and do you do mostly like 20th century British history?
I'm mainly 19th century.
19th century. Okay.
Yeah, if you take me to an archive in Britain and you show me something that's written after 1820, then I can make sense of it. Anything before that seems like super old timey, and like they use like F's instead of S's.
Sure. Yeah. All that.
It's rough. And then I'm good up until about 1914.
Okay.
And in 1914, the British state expands so much to fight the war, basically, that I find looking through the primary source records after 1914 to be just totally overwhelming.
Yeah,
and I
can see that.
I can't wrap my head around it.
I can see that.
So I'm very much a Victorianist. That's sort of like a long Victorian period is really where I'm comfortable.
Did you always, so you didn't always have an affinity for like the British, or were you an Anglophile? Like, would you describe yourself that way? Did you were you into Monty Python and stuff like that?
I was into Monty Python.
I actually didn't know I wasn't sure if I was going to show up today and you had like a British accent. You know what I mean? Like,
really?
I wasn't entirely. Yeah, I don't know you too well. I know you on like Twitter and Facebook, and I knew that you were from LA because I've heard you talk about it, but I've never heard your voice. So I'm like, maybe this guy's British. I'm not sure. Like, why would you study British history? It's so. This is such a pompous, like, Americanist thing. I think is like kind of like, well, that's interesting. Like, why'd you get interested in that? You know, well, why the British? Is your family British? Or like, no, that's literally your interest.
Yeah. It was really just interest. I mean, I guess I'm a bit of an Anglophile. I do like Britain. I do like British people.
Have you been there?
They're mainly cool. Yeah, I mean, tons of times.
Yeah.
My wife is Irish. Ireland is not Britain, but they do share certain.
I've heard that.
They do share certain like similarities.
Yeah.
They're closer to each other than either is to America.
Sure, and they have a contentious history.
Absolutely. No, it was really kind of an intellectual thing.
Yeah.
I think that got me into British history. It was the thing that I found most interesting. And one of the other things that I did as an undergraduate and then as a master's student, because I went to Northridge for my master's as well, as I studied world history. So this was the early to mid 2000s.
Okay.
World history had really, I think, caught on in the later 90s and sort of, in that period. And so it was this like new variety of scholarship, and Jeff was so good at, bringing undergraduates and then early graduate students into this world history conversation. And so I would sort of look at world history and I would match that with my interest in British history, and I would think like, well, if I want to understand the world, like Britain seems like the way to do it. Well, or at least one way, right?
Yeah, sure.
But I also had, like, I didn't really study much American history explicitly, but I did end up with some pretty formative research experience in the United States, which is that as a master's student, I got my first research job working for Thomas Andrews, who wrote a book called Killing for Coal about the Ludlow Massacre in 1914.
Yeah.
And he's an environmental historian. He was at CSUN then. He's at Colorado Boulder now. But he came along. He was hired the last semester of my senior year. So his very first seminar that he taught at CSUN was my last class as an undergraduate.
Okay.
And it was a seminar in environmental history, and like Thomas was amazing. He had us reading Raymond Williams and Guy Obese Kerry and like the whole like Marshall Solins debate. Like he had us doing like all this stuff, and he really showed me that like environmental history is the thing that you could write a history of things like food or water or fire. And then as I sort of like processed that, and that had a deep impact on me intellectually and kind of in all sorts of ways. And I remember sort of taking that and then going back and re-examining British and world history and thinking like, people really haven't talked about British history in this environmental way. Like there's historical geography, there's agricultural history, there's like lots of stuff. Right. But not really in this explicit like, let's talk about human beings and environments and like how those relate to each other.
It seems like environmental history is a ripe place for Marxists because of like the kind of material nature of the analysis you're doing. Is that accurate at all? I mean,
yes.
I think about like I don't know a whole lot about environmental history, but the book that was like a part of my orals that was kind of a linchpin for us at CUNY was William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis.
One of the best.
Yeah.
One of the best.
And
yeah.
like just knowing his work and like being aware of it. I think he was like president of AHA for a brief period.
He was
recently.
also Thomas Andrews' advisor.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah,
that,
like he's one of my, what do they call it? One of my academic grandparents.
Yeah. I mean, and it's funny because I guess he'd be like a step grandparent of mine in just the sense that I didn't like follow his work except that it influenced my thinking and made me. What I'm hearing from you is something that like is like you kind of like you find a different angle. You had your interest in British history, but then the environmental I don't know. For me, it was like discovering social and cultural history and being like, oh, people do this. Like this, you could do this. Like you could do oral histories and like interview people and then write about that. That's insane. And to me, that like led me to where I was going. So it sounds like environmental history was a big thing for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you don't call yourself an environmental historian, or do you?
I do.
Yeah.
I do
Yeah?
actually. So I tend to like when I write job letters and
yes,
things like that.
I've heard of these things.
Yeah, they're an awful genre that like punishes everybody involved.
Yeah, I want to come back to that because the job letter and the whole job process of being
it's
academic
terrible.
historian these days is
It's pretty terrible.
bleak.
But yeah, no, if I'm going to describe myself, I will say that I'm a cultural and environmental historian of modern Britain.
That's awesome.
And that my archival home is modern Britain, but I teach everything. I teach Western Civ, I teach European history, I teach a lot of world history.
You don't teach U.S. history though, like
No,
straight U.S. history.
No, I've done. Santa Monica College let me do California history a couple times.
Oh, that's cool.
Which was amazing, and
That's
I loved it.
awesome, yeah.
It was so much fun, and I have a real. Like, I guess I could say I dabble in California history.
Did you learn a lot teaching that class?
Yes.
Yeah, I that's why I always wanted to take give me a class that I haven't taught before, so I can like actually learn along with the student.
As long as I'm only teaching one new class at a time, that's great.
Yeah.
But when they come along, they're like, "Listen, we need you to teach this, that, and this."
Mm-hmm.
That's where the adjunct hustle becomes like an adjunct like train wreck, and you're like desperately cobbling together lessons on stuff you don't know.
And
that's rough.
Like to me, like that's just like desperately looking through Netflix or YouTube for a documentary that I can show like a clip of so that we can do an exercise in class and like have some sort of anchor to hold on to. As long as I had that anchor, I felt like I had like quote unquote prep done a little bit. But
my version of that is to look through podcast feeds.
Yeah.
To go through like In Our Time or like one of those, and I'll line up like 3 or 4 on a certain topic, take the notes, and then build a lecture out of that. And then I think like, okay, now I've done this lecture.
That's a great idea. God.
I mean, it sort of works.
Shortcuts, yeah.
It's not
sustainable.
No.
In the long term.
No, it's good in a pinch, but I wouldn't make it your main strategy. It's not
a model for like a whole semester. That's the thing. Semesters are long, and that's the worst semester I've ever had. And there are only a few that have gone this way. Are when you feel like you've like run out of material, and you're like, I'm looking at the syllabus, and there are 4 weeks left, and you're kind of like, we're saying the same things over and over. I think that podcast thing would help there, just to like refresh a little bit, find a new angle.
The class that I've really run into that problem with is the history of zombies, which I teach. I teach it at Laguna College, and it's a weird thing because the class was my idea.
Yep.
And a couple of years ago, I was sitting at a faculty meeting, and I had been watching. I binged The Walking Dead, and I was sitting next to the chair of the liberal arts, and I was like, "Hey, man, like, what if we just did a class on this?" And I sort of sketched out a bunch of movies, and I was like, "Yeah, zombies would be a cool class."
Totally.
And he was into it, and he said, "Yeah, this is great." And I team taught it with a good friend of mine, a guy named Norm, the first semester, and it went really well. Our personalities meshed really well. He had a lot of crazy angles. He's a scholar of literature and of horror in particular.
Yeah.
So he was really well suited to it.
Cool.
And I would sort of provide like kind of historical background. But then he got basically promoted, and they said, "Oh, now the class is all yours."
You're like, oh, I had an expert
good.
here.
Yeah, it hasn't been very good. And I'm doing it again.
I find
in the
that
spring.
happens in classes that are like the specialized classes that sound like they're going to be really fun. Like the classes that went wrong for me were classes that were like specialized topics like that. Or I had a friend that taught a class on disco. He's like, I'm going to teach a class on disco, and it's going to be like, we're just going to do disco for 3.5 months. And it's like, well, just remember, you're going to be doing disco for 3.5 months.
Right.
And after about a month, it was like we're saying the same things over and over and over again. It's like a warning of like those kinds of classes seem like you need to like really structure your syllabus and have a lot of different angles on it.
Yes.
Otherwise,
Yeah, there's a real like between the forest and the trees kind of thing, I think, to good teaching.
Yeah.
If you are way out and you're teaching these huge level surveys, like one course that I truly do not enjoy teaching is the first part of world history. So it's usually world history to 1500, something like that. That's a brutally difficult class.
Yeah.
Because
I can imagine.
It's really hard to construct any kind of narrative. And you're not necessarily obligated to, but you do got to have some kind of frame to like hold the class together and some kind of analytical approach. And you are to some extent on the hook for covering a really wide range of content.
Yeah.
And so that class is like all forest. It's very difficult in that class to get sort of detailed coverage and really engage with particular things.
It seems like you just have to, you choose particular stories, I guess. And
Yeah, mine tends to be more theoretical, so I sort of pick a set of concepts, and I'm like, so one concept we'll spend a lot of time on is like the state.
Right.
So I've got this long section of like, okay, like what is a state? And I try to do theoretical approaches as much as I can in class.
That's cool. Yeah, I think that's useful.
So if we're going to do the state, we'll like start with Weber and be like, okay, like what is a state? Let's define this. And then you can sort of apply that historically. But then, so that gets you then reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, and, and maybe you're going to read like, I don't know, what are they called? The Spring and Autumn Annals from ancient China. But that's not quite the same as like coverage, right? And so, so if you go and talk to the department, what the department will say is, well, you need to cover ancient India and ancient China and ancient Southeast Asia, and they give you this gigantic list of things, and it's like
we're just going to be doing like a Wikipedia run through, It feels like you could just show the. My impulse would just be to like show the first 45 minutes of 2001, and then it's just like, there you go, the beginnings of civilization.
Yeah.
There were a bunch of apes, and then some sort of like brick from space came down.
Just simplify it, right?
Right. It's just, it might.
Our causal mechanism is literally this black box right here.
A monolith. I was thinking about environmental history, and to me, it's like this was in vogue, I think of like. My dad reads a lot of like popular histories and stuff like that. I call it Costco history, but like this stuff like the books you can buy at Costco, Bill O'Reilly books and stuff like that, like just popular stuff. But they sell like
as bad as I can imagine though, because Bill O'Reilly books sound pretty
Bill O'Reilly's really bad, but
catastrophic.
I'm thinking of one that's not so bad. But I think, and I wanted your opinion on it because I feel like it's kind of environmental history. It's like the guy that does like guns, germs, and
Jared
steel,
Diamond.
right? Is he like the like? It's like the Ken Burns, like the like kind of like pop culture star of environmental history a little bit.
I think that's probably fair. I would say if you want, I don't.
Diamond is it?
Jared Diamond.
Jared Diamond, that's right.
Yeah. So I don't like that book.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that Alfred Crosby's Ecological Imperialism makes effectively the same argument.
Yeah.
But is much more careful.
Is Crosby the guy that does the Columbian Exchange?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, really prolific early environmental historian, writing this stuff in like the 70s, which was, so he was one of the like sort of cutting edge types. Diamonds, I would argue the problem with diamonds, this is a conversation that I've had like many times with students in environmental history.
Cool.
It's also really a big issue on Reddit's Ask Historians. I don't know if we'll talk about that.
Well, later, I guess I could call this Reddit history instead of Costco history, but because I feel like Jared Diamond's work is popular among those types of people.
Yeah.
Reddit kids, whatever they might
be. If you are a 20-something white male who's super into like programming, then like Jared Diamond's going to really appeal.
But it's like a material history, essentially, right? It's kind of like I haven't read that book, but from what I gather, it's about like he's using like material like resources and conditions to kind of explain historical change.
Yeah, to an extent.
Yeah.
He's making essentially a geographical argument. And my understanding of the relevant literature is that what's really new about him is that he's the first one to go through and sort of identify really systematically the origins of things like domesticated plants and animals, and to sort of chart these out and say like, okay, Australia has no main starches that are domesticated today, right? And South America has one, and North America has one, and so on. And so like, okay, that's cool. So he makes that contribution. Where he really falls down is the fact that he's not a historian, and so he tends to kind of overinterpret certain pieces of evidence.
Yeah.
So he's got discussions of like Francisco Pizarro's sort of conquest of the Incan Empire.
Right.
And he sort of looks at this and he'll be like, well, Pizarro comes from a society that has had writing for much longer, so they're much better at sending messages. And really, if you think critically about it, it's nonsense. Like, it's basically garbage, and it showed that he had not read any colonial Latin American history at all. Mm-hmm. And that's where the book really falls down, that he makes some important observations and then tries to explain everything from these observations.
And that is very much like in the Reddit mode of of analysis, is always kind of like this, not reading anything of a discipline, but then like assuming all of it, and that historians have never looked at this, saying things like that.
Yeah.
Like, this is a whole new interpretation because historians would never look at this. And it's like, do you know what historians have looked at? Have you looked at every?
He doesn't.
Right. Right.
I think it's scientistic. And Diamond is, I believe he's an ornithologist by training.
Yeah.
I mean, he will talk about himself as a scientist. And I don't have any personal beef against science. Apologies to any scientists listening. But science studies the general, right? So they look to take a particular observation and then expand that analysis to an explanation to kind of everything, right? And that's what he does. And historians study the particular. We study things in a specific time and a place. And so
that makes sense.
So we know not to do that, right? Mm-hmm. And if you read Crosby's Ecological Imperialism, he makes all the same arguments that Diamond does. But Crosby knows when to stop. He knows when to say, this set of organisms was important in a particular thing, but does not lead to America being rich today and like other people being poor, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is like, it said like, are there Marxists and environmental historians and people that do this kind of work, whether it be historical or whatever. I feel like they're likely to kind of have a more kind of, I don't know, a material understanding of the way things work that leads them to Marxism, but it's certainly not true with Diamond, right? I mean, it's not like part of his project at all. He doesn't seem like he's making that kind of political intervention at all.
No, not at all, to talk about things like class or even really economy. As I recall, I don't think he discusses economy as a thing.
It's just like the way things work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think there is a strong strand of environmental history that lends itself to Marxian analysis.
Yeah,
and so like one of the things I do to give you an idea of how this kind of works, one of the books that I teach a lot in my global environmental history class is Gua and Gadgil's History of India, ecological history, called This Fissured Land. So it's an ecological history of India over a very long period of time. And they wrote this back in the early 90s. And they are both Marxian scholars. Mm-hmm. And the overall argument of the book is that Marx was not materialist enough because he did not consider environments. Mm-hmm. That Marx sort of starts with commodities as they are in the marketplace. Right. And so what they want to do in this is sort of drop modes of production and instead use modes of resource use. Right. Which describe foraging or gathering societies, pastoralists, agrarian, and then industrial societies. And so it's like Marxism, but at a much broader kind of level. And I think that's certainly not the approach of all environmental historians. But I think you kind of gotta come to it from that. Yeah, you gotta have that perspective there.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about politics because it sounds like you went to graduate school at CSUN during the Bush years, and then into Obama, right? Mm-hmm. And then rounding it out with Trump. And I always think that's that arc, whatever it might mean, that arc of like George W. Bush, 9/11, leading into these weird 8 years of Obama, and then capped off by Trump, is like, that's the story of our adult lives, like at least people that are roughly our age. Mm-hmm. What was it like going to graduate school during that time? I say that maybe to be a little more specific. What was it like? I was surrounded at CUNY by like a lot of like radicals, a lot of like left Marxists, and I wasn't ready for that. Like, I was stupid. I went to CUNY because it was cheap and I could get in. And when I got there, I realized, there's all these like anarchists and Marxists and radicals of all kinds, and like I didn't really know that world too well. I thought like, Michael Moore was kind of as left as it went, or maybe I was into Chomsky, I think probably, but I just didn't really get that they were like real Marxists. Was that your experience at CSUN? Are there radicals at CSUN? Are there radicals in California? No?
There are radicals in California.
Yeah,
not really.
California
at CSUN.
graduate schools, I should say. I know there are radicals in California.
So at CSUN, during the Bush years, I guess looking back, I was basically liberal but not left. That is, I grew up in a household that was essentially Democratic partisans.
Right.
Both my parents had always voted Democrat for sort of forever, right? My mother used to throw things at the TV during the Reagan administration. They were big fans of Clinton. So that was my sort of default setting.
Don't stop thinking about tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The first election I voted in was for Al Gore.
Yeah.
And then to watch the Supreme Court do that, that was really disappointing. And I can remember being like 20 years old or 21 at the time or whatever it was, and sort of sitting down and thinking, oh man, democracy has failed because George W. Bush is president.
Yeah, and also just how dirty it felt, all of it, the Florida thing, and the way the Supreme Court went, the fact that I remember there was that was the golden era of these lefty documentaries. If you remember, there were all these I'll forget the name of them now, but they were all pretty popular. You could rent them at Blockbuster, and they told the story of the election and things like that. Totally different media landscape in some ways. And
the other thing that was really big in the years sort of right after George W. Bush's election, and then 9/11, and then the run up to the Iraq War, were Lefty Blogs.
Yeah,
that was when the sort of liberal left blogosphere really blossomed. And so if you look at a lot of the pretty prominent liberal or left journalists today, a lot of them got their start at blogs. So Ezra Klein, Josh Marshall, Matt Iglesias, Brian Beutler, I think was another one. There's a whole stable of them,
and even on the other side of Breitbart and Huffington. Huffington's what kind of liberal Huffington Post is supposed to be.
I guess.
I can't even read that website. If you look at it, it's completely
I left that years ago.
But yeah, there was and I think about Greg Palast. I don't know if you remember him. He did he was an investigative journalist. Did the best democracy money can buy, and he talked a lot about how Bush had stolen the election and used I think it was called, if I remember, it was the Diebold or Diebold voting machines, and all that stuff really influenced me at a young age of kind of thinking for me it pushed me to cynicism and feeling God, what's the point of even fucking participating? They're just going to steal your vote. Is that
right? And you remember the mood on the left at that time. So through W's first administration, in the aftermath of 9/11 and the whole Don Rumsfeld kind of world that we inhabited.
All the villains.
John
Ashcroft.
And Dick Cheney was the worst, and these people just seemed horrible. And then for the Democrats to nominate John Kerry, who was just comically incompetent as a candidate.
Yeah.
I'm sure he's a fine dude, whatever. But he was a garbage candidate. And then
reporting for duty. I remember when he showed up and did that salute, I said, "Oh, he's not going to win."
Yeah. I knew he wasn't going to win when he did an interview with MTV right after he'd clinched the nomination, and he had just gotten the nomination, and I was watching TV, and I was like, oh, okay, here we go, John Kerry. Let's see what this guy's all about. And he gets on there, and they ask him the most softball question, which was something like, hey, tell us about some, inspiring figures for today's youth. And he just got up there, and he didn't have an answer. And he was like, well, gee, I don't know. Boy, it's pretty hard. When I was a kid, JFK was great. And I remember looking at that and thinking, this kind of trash is what you're going to try to convince people with?
And the Democrats are still doing this. Yes. And they're trying to convince people that and they're just assuming that they're the edgy, cool, hip ones. When it's the evidence, I don't know if you've seen that clip of the 1996 Democratic National Convention where they're all doing the Macarena, and it's they play the music. No, it's the most painful hashtag cringe thing you've ever seen in your life. But it's they're we're the base of America, and we're cool and edgy, and Bill Clinton kind of the 90s, I think, put that in the minds of a lot of young people that are now in their 30s and 40s that still are clinging to this idea that the Democrats are, of course, the cool ones because they're down with gay people or they're pro-choice. It's the party is just not, the party just isn't that, and uses that stuff really cynically.
If you were to say what have I learned as an adult in the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations.
Right.
I think Trump forces us to reassess things a little bit, but from Bush and Obama, I mean, what I took away from that is that the Republican Party will actively try to destroy everything that I think is good.
Yeah.
And the Democratic Party will not make things much worse.
Right.
But they probably won't make things very much better.
Mm-hmm.
They will just kind of be like, hey, things are not actively collapsing.
Right.
Whereas the Republicans will get in power and be like, let's destroy everything that is good.
Yeah. I mean, it's really been a struggle, I think, to think about through that stuff for a lot of people. I think, I mean, it's what's going on right now in the fights of, like, I don't know if you're following anything like the rise of, like, Bernie politics, you know, the DSA. You know, there's kind of like this same question is still there. Like, what the fuck do we do with the Democratic Party? Mm-hmm. Like, do we challenge it to be better? Do we? I mean, for me, my question was always, and I think you kind of answered it for yourself just now, but, like, you know, is there a difference between Democrats and Republicans? And, like, and what is it, if that's true? Mm-hmm. That's a really hard thing to think through, because
I mean, it seems like a lot of this is really the effect of Clinton and before that of Reagan, right? Because, like, Reagan was so devastatingly popular
mm-hmm.
in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And David Sahat from the Mind Pop podcast had an episode a few months ago where he outlined Reagan's whole approach as a kind of wish fulfillment politics for the Republican Party, that mm-hmm. he got in there and was like, hey guys, we can cut taxes as much as we want, mm-hmm. and then we'll just say that, like, the deficit will just magically go away, right? And so it was sort of it was a new era in politics that you could show up and do things that by all expert measures at the time were stupid policies.
Right.
You could do that, and then you could be super popular, mm-hmm. right? And so that obviously sort of changed the political landscape mm-hmm. of the United States, right? Mm-hmm. And then Clinton in the 90s, like, won. You know, he won fairly decisively, mm-hmm. 2 victories. And I think that a lot of the problems the Democratic Party has right now are that the people in charge of it are the ones who sort of came through the Clinton years.
Yep. Yeah.
And the recipe for success in those years was that you don't ever talk about raising taxes. Mm-hmm. You don't talk about government programs. You have to sort of, like, hide what you're doing with the government because the government is the problem, right? Like,
it becomes murky over the years. It becomes murky, and you're kind of like, and I think it's also a product of this, you know, this period of time in which, you know, 9/11 happened, and, like, the mm-hmm. Republicans became this kind of, like, juggernaut of the people that, like, you know, keep you safe, and war and homeland security and all that stuff. And the Democrats didn't really fight back publicly against a lot of the, you know, rising Islamophobia and all that stuff, and it kind of left them in this weird position where you're like, what do the Democrats represent besides maybe, well, they stand against the ugliest excesses of the Republicans, but that seems like that's not enough to get. It's a negative message, in other words.
Right.
That's what we fear, right? Is that the Democrats are going to go with, like, well, we're not Trump message, and that didn't work this last time, and it's not going to work again.
No, and they, you know, and I think it's because so many Democratic politicians and leaders now, coming out of the Bill Clinton school, what they learned is that you go to the center, right?
Yeah,
that you sort of claim the center, you sort of discuss compromise, you discuss sort of, like, sensible moderation. And, you know, I guess what you could say is what the Republican Party has learned, whether explicitly or implicitly, is that they can just go further and further to the right, and the Democrats will always come halfway.
And
right?
and you move the center further and further and further right. Yeah,
exactly.
I think that's probably the story of our lives in a lot of ways, is watching that quote unquote center place, mm-hmm. like, going. And that's why when I hear, like, this, especially Democrats saying this stuff on, like, you know, whether it be like John Oliver or Jimmy Kimmel or, like, all these kind of, like, late night hosts that have become, they've all turned into, like, Edward R. Murrow all of a sudden. Yeah. Like, Jimmy Kimmel was doing, like, fart jokes on Howard Stern a couple years ago. Now he's, like, you know, giving, like, serious monologues about policy, and crying every night. But yeah, this kind of, like, this kind of message that, you know, we're not Trump, and the Republicans are the bad guys. And if we could just kind of go back to a place where, you know, the far left is doing horrible things and the far right is doing horrible, we just need to go back to. It sounds like Make America Great Again to me. You know
it sounds like the Rally to Restore Sanity. Do you remember that?
Yes.
From Jon Stewart?
So embarrassing, dude.
Yes. Yeah. In retrospect, you can look back on that and think, like, that was a terrible response.
Yeah.
It was, And I think that response is still common among liberals, which is why I think that like I was sort of liberal growing up, and I would identify myself as left now. Because like for these liberals, the question is always like, well, sooner or later, these Republicans are going to be so crazy that their voters will suddenly see reason or something like that.
That there's like a base of rationalism in America.
And it just doesn't seem to be true.
No, they'll go crazier and crazier.
Partisanship is much more powerful than that. Yeah. And I think sort of Fox News and right-wing media has a lot to do with that, because it does seem to be the case that a big chunk of the country, maybe, I don't know, 30%, something like that, enough to win elections anyways, will basically believe whatever Sean Hannity tells them to believe.
And it always gets me that like people say, well, we have Fox News on the right and MSNBC on the left. Right. And it's like, well, no, that's not. I mean, Fox News is hardcore right wing. I mean, they're like, I could say that like a lot of the stuff they do on Fox, on that network is just straight up fascist propaganda.
Absolutely.
But then MSNBC is, I don't think of it as the Che Guevara network. You know what I mean? Like the way it's often portrayed by the right is that, the MSNBC is like, and Rachel Maddow is like leading some sort of like communist revolution. But it's like, if you're a person that knows anything about like what the left is about, that's a joke. Like we don't really have that. It would be amazing if we did.
Right.
Like, and if we had like a left-wing Fox News, it'd be incredible.
Oh yeah. If the liberal media was as liberal as Fox News claims it is, that would be terrific.
Right.
And the same is true with like New York Times. The way that the right will sort of go on about the New York Times as this like bunch of like radical, like Molotov cocktail throwing radicals. It's just not. Like it's empirically not. It's objectively not.
They spent. I mean, New York Times is like. I mean, for me, like it was watching the documentary and reading probably parts of the book Manufacturing Consent when I was young, and like his whole thing about the New York Times, that he just like devastates the idea of the New York Times as this like left wing or liberal, even liberal. I mean, it depends what your definition of the word liberal is, but like the New York Times comes off as just kind of like state propaganda, corporate propaganda. They're complicit in erasing news in a lot of ways. I mean, that's what's weird about this moment where Trump is going after like fake news, because like that's media criticism that he's doing, like strange in a really profane way. Like most Americans have some sense that like whether they haven't read Manufacturing Consent, but they have some sense that like they're not being told the truth.
I mean, we don't trust the media anymore, right? Right. Like trust in institutions is way down, and has been declining pretty steadily since, I guess, Nixon.
Well, in voting too, right? Yeah. And it's like, so you hear these people that say like, we're losing democracy, but it seems like that's part of it, right? Is that like we tried to like wrap our heads around this on this show before, but like the idea that like people live in alternate realities now, and like the internet has allowed people to just kind of like believe whatever they want to believe. It's weird to be an academic at this moment. Yes. Where you're kind of like grounded in like like very careful analysis, using lots of evidence. We're at a moment of just like, is that ever discouraging to you, or how do you kind of conceive of yourself as like, sometimes I feel like I'm in the Victorian era. You know what I mean? Like what I do is so old-fashioned in some respects. Do you think we're gonna? I don't know. I feel like we might watch like a transformation of what academia is in our lifetime.
Oh, I think we're seeing it. I think we're seeing it. I would argue that we are seeing for the first time now, in just the last like year or two, the profound transformations at all levels of human interaction that the internet is really capable of. Yeah. That the 2000s, the internet was there, it was growing. It didn't really change the name of the game for much. But I think we can say now, in the aftermath of Trump, that like, or sort of in the middle of Trump, that like this is our future with an internet as it exists right now, and of course it will change. But like right now, it means a highly fragmented kind of national discourse. Yes. In which like the really bloody fights are kind of internal struggles on different sides. There's almost no real exchange of ideas between sort of people across the spectrum. In my view, that's because about half of the spectrum lives in a fantasy world that does not exist. Yeah. And they are, actively being propagandized at effectively. I think the other half of the spectrum does have its share of kind of like stupid nonsense, right? But I think is also much more grounded in in kind of empirical reality.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think it's an accident that like basically all academics are on the left of the spectrum now.
Right.
And it's not that you show up in grad school and they're like, here's Marx, although that did happen to me.
Yeah.
But no, it's
real, that did happen.
It did. No, it did. The first quarter of theory at Irvine is everything that Marx wrote.
Yeah.
Now that said, you don't walk out of that being like, yep, we're all Marxists now.
No, in fact, I felt like my professors in graduate school were like barriers against Marxist thinking in a lot of ways. Like they weren't. They were there to kind of like our professors weren't particularly radical. I mean, there were a few that were probably a little more so, but I think they kind of saw us as, because there were a lot of like at our school there was like a lot of like just, I don't know, like Occupy kids, anarcho kids, like there were real radicals that like kind of challenged everything the professor had to say, and the professors were kind of, I don't know, they were moderating impulse, like they were like they had a kind of like moderating effect on that radicalism, if that makes sense.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah. I didn't get too much of that. There were some, and there were certainly some professors at Irvine that were and I guess still are like quite radical. In a variety of different sort of arenas. My view of it, if we think like whatever one's kind of political orientation, I think if you look at the last 50 years of history writing, and you look at the sort of kind of Marxian strands that have been there, and then you look at the various responses to Marx, various kinds of like the whole cultural turn of like, hey, gender is at least as important as class.
Yeah.
Ideas of race becoming historicized. Ideas of sexuality. All of these things. You look at that across history. You look at it across sociology and anthropology and economics to an extent now, political science. What I would argue that shows is that the basic assumptions of most conservatives are wrong.
Yeah.
that like there is not one way that like families are supposed to be. There's not like, and sort of objective kind of greatness to a given group of human beings. There's
no such thing as this magical free market that they kind of look at as if it's like a natural law or even from God.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's why through my career as an academic, I don't know anybody, I mean, literally nobody, that went to graduate school in any humanities or social science field and moved to the right.
Right.
Everybody I know moved some degree to the left.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. Yep.
And like I remember a woman came as a graduate student when I was already advanced at Irvine. I was probably like my 4th or 5th year, and she showed up, but she was gonna work with my advisor. She was doing British history, and so they were kind of like, hey, go talk to her, like, bring the new people in,
Sure.
right? And so I remember talking to her, and we were just sort of like working out like what each other was all about. And she came from a very like culturally conservative background, and she was like, oh man, I just hate Marxists so much. And I remember thinking like, really, like.
Yeah.
What for?
Yeah, and where are they? Yeah, that you hate them. Yeah.
Yeah. Why would you bother? You know. And then I remember seeing one of her Facebook statuses, 5 or 6 years later, where she's practically waving the red flag.
Yeah.
And I think that's just.
And I think you're right to say that's as much as the right likes to think about that, that academics are almost all left wings, especially in the humanities, and science is a whole other thing, but like. Especially in the humanities, you have like Marxist academics, and they're everywhere. The right says that, well, that's because of propaganda. That's like, what you're saying, like professor just tells you what to think. But both of us, I think, know that's not true because we've gone through the process. It's something a little more complicated than that. Like it's weird because it leaves me that smug, that kind of smug attitude that like Neil deGrasse Tyson posted the other day.
The worst.
Make America smart again. Which is gross on so many levels, and it's always the assumption that he and his clan are the smartest people, and that there was some era in American history where everyone was quote unquote smart.
Right.
It's a really problematic phrase.
I mean, the average level of education in the United States during World War II was what, 8th grade?
Right. But then on the other hand, like we're sitting here saying like, well, if you go to graduate school for the humanities, you become left wing. Basically, like we're saying that like the smarter people are on the left, right? Like I wouldn't be on the left if I didn't believe that, I guess.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I recognize like how condescending that sounds.
Right.
It's hard. It's really tricky.
I guess we're smart, but we have better evidence.
Yeah. There you go.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's really hard. So I think we got to go, but I wanted to ask you about about jobs. You know, we talked about job letter, and like, you know, I don't people outside of academia or people that are maybe thinking about going into academia don't understand, I think, really this process of like getting a job, especially now. Like, I mean, for people that don't know, I think like in history especially, and like there are other fields that are like this too, I think. It's just really discouraging because the amount of full-time jobs, like, and I mean full-time tenure-track jobs where you have like job security, a living wage, and benefits are very small. Like those jobs don't come up very often. And when they do, you have like 500 to 1,000 PhDs.
Yep.
People that have graduated anywhere from like a year ago to 5 years ago are applying for it because they haven't gotten jobs yet. And it just seems like you look at the numbers, I'm like, really discouraged. Is that where you're at too?
Yes. The numbers are trash.
Yes.
So I believe it was in 1970, more than 2/3 of American sort of people who were teaching at the college university level were sort of full-time, tenured or tenure track. And today that figure is less than a third. I think it might be down to a quarter.
Because schools are using, for those that don't know, schools are using contingent labor,
right?
Like both of us, you know, adjuncts that are, you know, basically, you know, when we go around to all these campuses and teach, you know, I don't know about you, but I feel very like alienated from the campus. It's not.
Oh yeah.
You don't really have an office there. You just kind of like show up and teach your classes and leave, and there are a bunch of full timers there that don't know you. I mean, I worked for 12 years at one school, adjunct, same school. Saw the same people all the time. Never really met them or talked to them for years and years. And it's really kind of like there's something humiliating about it a little bit.
Absolutely.
It's like reinforces this hierarchy. But
yes. And you don't really know, like the hard part I think really is the insecurity. Like you don't really know when you're going to get work. And so I got an email just the other day saying, hey, we're going to offer you 2 classes at one of my institutions. Up until then, I wasn't sure. I don't really know. Yeah. And
hard to plan a year.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. You never really know what kind of work you're going to get. And it's a precarious situation. And so in that sense, we could make a lot less as well. And like, you know,
that's why you have to run around teaching mini classes. Yeah.
And I've never had a job that got me dental insurance. So, you know, I'm almost 38 now, and I haven't had insurance since I was 18, and I was living with my parents. I've never had a job that gave me retirement benefits of any real amount. And so, like, yeah, you know, we're higher education runs on the exploitation of adjunct labor. Like that seems to be a fact, right? That without us, that system would not work as it does. And it's a bummer in so many ways as well, because on one level you can sort of look at this and say like, oh, here's like the rationale of like late capitalism like playing out as education is commodified, and you know, we are nothing but exploited labor. At the same time, the market even for adjunct labor is garbage. I've never gotten a position as an adjunct without knowing somebody at a campus.
Same here. That's what I mean. That's the difficulty I'm encountering having moved to California. Is I think I'm only going to get positions at places where I know people, and I don't know people that many people. And you know, I have different people that are trying, but it's also, you know, there's got to be openings. And I mean, do you find that older professors like don't get this? Like, I have older professors who have told me like, well, you know, why don't you just go adjunct? You know, if you pick up a few classes, you know, at the local community college. And I say, do you realize that like it's not that easy? Like going and getting it, I can't just go get a job at the local community college. I can write a letter to the chair and have the chair write back like, well, we don't have any openings right now, but you're welcome to submit your materials to the adjunct pool. And in case of future openings, we'll let you know. Like that's as far as you're getting on that road.
And 9 out of 10 times when you do that, you will never hear anything back from them.
No.
And you know, because I've done that dozens of times. You know, literally going through a not quite a phone book, but
Yeah.
Googling like
Sure.
higher education, and then just going through a list and emailing the chair of every department and saying, hey, here are the classes I can teach. Here's evidence of my skills.
Yep.
Here's what I'm all about. And most of the time, you're just throwing paper into a void.
90% of the time I send those letters, and I've sent a lot of them, I get nothing back.
Right.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
And so, that component of it is garbage. And then the actual search for full-time jobs
Yes.
is one of the most dysfunctional things that I've ever encountered. So I was on a search committee as a graduate student at Irvine.
That's good. That gives you like a little idea of what it's actually like, right?
It was for a modern Europe and the world position. And I believe we got 400 applicants for one spot. And I mean, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about like what good applications look like.
Yeah.
I also learned that broadly speaking, academics apply to way too many jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Fully half of these people were simply not qualified.
Yeah.
That is, they did not fulfill the basics of the job ad. And the job ad said, we want someone that teaches modern Europe and that does world history. And we got a lot of people who were like, well, I study, anarchists in northern Italy in the 1920s, and I'm aware that the world exists.
Yeah,
and that would
right.
that would be it. And it was clear looking at that like, okay,
The
like,
arrogance of people.
yes,
But
like that was a cool topic. Like
my
I'm
wife,
sure your
Claudia,
research is good. But
She was on a search committee in English, and it was a similar thing. Hundreds of people applying for a full-time professor of literature position, and she's like, she was shocked because there were tons of lawyers that applied, like just lawyers. Like, well, I got a law degree, so I could probably teach English.
wow.
And it's like, do you realize, like, it's so demeaning, like it's so insulting to the people that have actually like gone through 8 years of studying English literature to become literature professors to be like, well, I have a law degree, so I can probably do that. I think you said a lot of English. Like people are like, I speak English, so I can teach it. And like, are you fucking kidding me?
And it's a waste of everybody's time.
Yep.
It's a tremendous waste of people's energy because as if you're on the job committee, you kind of have to look at these applications.
Yep.
And there's literally hundreds.
Take them seriously, yeah.
And most of them, just went into the bin with hardly a second look.
Have you gotten any interviews?
I have.
How far have you gotten in this process?
I've gotten an interview.
Okay.
The whole process, the advice you get about the process is really strange.
Yep.
And I think most of it is bad. Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's some good advice, but I remember they used to do. So PhD programs are getting a lot better about trying to prepare students for the job market or for sort of alternative careers and whatever.
The alt-ac
Yes.
track, yes.
But it's there's a real sort of lack of expertise in established history departments for like what that means because they're all coming out of these senior people in all these departments have not experienced quite what we have.
They wrote their dissertations on typewriters in the 70s and 80s. Seriously.
Right. Or even in the 90s, right? And
Uh-huh.
things have changed a lot since then. And so I remember, one time we went to this job sort of advice thing, and this guy just comes in and he sits down and he just looked at us all and he was like, well, when I was graduating, I just applied to a bunch of places and I got 3 interviews and I just took my time deciding. I went and hung out on a beach for a while and then I picked and everything has been great.
Fuck you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he looked at us like, well, why don't you guys just do that?
Yeah, yeah.
And like that was absolutely
That's what
trash.
I've encountered. Is like this kind of like, well, why don't you just do what I did?
Right.
But in a totally different context. Yeah.
I guess it's because we're all idiots. I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah. So do you like? Because the thing that I was told when going to graduate school in New York, everyone said, well, and I wonder if this is the same thing in LA. People said, well, don't plan on staying in New York. You're going to have to apply and go to like Nebraska or some other place in the middle of the country in a place you don't want to be. Are you applying to jobs like that? Or are you like, I'm staying in LA?
I'm applying to places all over.
Yeah.
But I have a family. I have 2 children.
Yeah.
I have a wife who's got a career and.
It's hard, right?
Well, I'm lucky in that sense because lots of people don't have a spouse that is fairly well paid, right?
That's what I've got too. See, we're soul twins. Because my wife, people know she has a full-time job and has had a full-time tenure-track job for a long time. So we're good.
Yeah.
And, kind of, like in terms of like, I've got health insurance and stuff like that. But we both got, huge student loans and bills. Rent is not cheap, and
it's brutal.
Cars and everything else. I can't just not work. Like I have to do something.
Right.
But it's weird to be like this. I'm honestly like sitting like as in my first months in California here, like figuring out like what is it that I could do for money that's not in academia. It's really tricky because you apply for even like a customer service job or a retail job, and they want a resume, and like my resume is that I've just taught a bunch of classes in U.S. history at like NYU and CUNY. Like that's not going to work. It's not gonna, I've written myself out of like a whole job market basically. I'm stuck in this one and it's broken. It's really it's a really hard, weird road.
Yeah, and I guess there are some people who have managed to transition to other careers.
Yeah,
I mean there must be, because universities keep cranking out PhDs, and
I think a lot of people are podcasting. Like have Patreons and stuff like that.
They've gone to Twitter full time.
That's their profession. I mean, hey, we live in a cartoon reality, and it feels
Why not?
like
Go for it.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.
Okay, I want to thank my guest, David Fouser. I had a really great time hanging out with him in Highland Park, learning about the historian's trade in Los Angeles. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. You can find more and you can support the show. Whatever amount you can donate is definitely appreciated, especially at this time of uncertain employment for me. It really helps keep the show going, so I appreciate those that are supporting the show, and you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thanks a lot, and we will talk to you next time.